Hi, folks. Welcome to episode 15 of the Saturday Sauna Night podcast. I'm your host, Steve. Tonight's episode, I had the chance to talk with Dan Truckey, the director and curator for the Beamuier Heritage Center at Northern Michigan University. We had the chance to talk a bit about his work with the Beamuier Heritage Center and some of the exhibits and collections they have, and then do kind of a deep dive into Upper Peninsula culture and what it is that makes a Yooper. Now, because Zoom has a 40-minute time limit, we actually recorded this in two segments, and I've edited the footage together into a single cohesive conversation. So grab your towel, get ready to throw some steam. It's time for Saturday Sauna Night. So Dan, thanks again for taking some time to talk with me tonight. So you are the director, right, of the Beamuier Heritage Center
Right.
housed at NMU. Can you kind of just talk a little bit about your role there and what the center does? And yeah.
Well, my role, I'm the director, but I'm also the curator, which means that I get to have fun in addition to all the administrative stuff. But it also means that I'm the only full-time employee of the center. Um, so I'm involved in pretty much everything. Everything from developing exhibitions and doing research for those to developing public programming for the campus community and the community in general, which could be everything from folk music concerts to lectures to workshops, um, and then also the collections management of the Beamuier Center, because we have about 5,000 items in our collection, mostly from the university, its collection. Though I finally have a trained part-time person who's working with those collections. So I'm very fortunate to finally, after being here 15 years, have somebody who can help me out in that area because it needs a lot of work. But what we are dedicated to is the history and culture of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, the entire UP. And so what we're trying to do is tell stories about the Upper Peninsula. We're trying to get the public interested in its history, but also to understand the culture of the UP and its people, and also to some extent try to preserve it. Not only the historical past, but how that has influenced who we are today. The identity of the Yooper, if you think of it that way, is what were the things that helped create that identity, and why is it important to the UP today? It's changed a lot. I moved to the UP when I was 11 in 1978. And Yooper identity at that point was still kind of in its, I was sort of an infancy of sorts. I mean, people identified with being Yoopers, though it was a relatively new word on the landscape. But they hadn't really embraced it as a culture, as a identity yet. It would be in the next decade that would start to really be defined. And now it's something of a point of pride for people up here. At one time, it was kind of something that they thought was more thrust on them by other people. And now it's something that we identify with. So it's really looking at those things and what are the things that define us. And one of the things I really love about our institution is that all of our exhibits are temporary exhibits. We create exhibits that are only up for 3, 4, maybe 5 months at a time, and then we tear it down and we put something new up because we always want to be delving into new territory, and we don't want it to get static. And it's allowed us over the time. I think I've created displayed about 30 different exhibits in the past 15 years or more, that it really covered a lot of territory of UP history and culture, and some are things that have never really been looked at before. So I think that's really what our goals are, and the role that we serve. And we see it, and we're on campus, but we don't see our role as just being a campus entity. I think a lot of people who don't work at Northern or go to Northern sometimes think, oh, that's Northern. That's not for us, or they don't really have any influence outside of Northern. And that's, for us, is not the case. It's, for us, our outward reach to the community and to the whole UP is really important. So, I mean, I'm traveling a lot, speaking at places around the UP, and have been ever since I've been here. I worked with people around the UP. Our current exhibit, which is on downhill skiing in the UP, I mean, I traveled all over the UP, you know, collecting materials and doing research and artifacts. And that's the best part of my job, is when I get to do that kind of stuff. And that's why I love that I can do that in addition to being a director, because a lot of times directors of museums don't get to do the research. And I still get to. That's part of the reason that I came here and did this job, is because I wanted to continue to do that.
Well, that's great. And you brought up a lot of interesting things that I actually want to ask a little bit more about too. The first thing, so kind of going back to, you were talking about kind of the point of pride in sort of a unique Upper identity. Now, I've heard, and you know, I'm relatively young, but I've heard secondhand. Is there any truth to the idea that Upper was originally kind of a derogatory thing, or just, or like you said, kind of created by an outside entity and kind of just used as a descriptor for people up here?
Well, I think that there's some evidence to show that the actual term was created when there was a poll. I think it was the Escanaba Daily Press did a poll asking people what name would they give to the residents of the Upper Peninsula, and they had this huge list, but the one that, I don't know how they came to it, it was, they selected it, or it was the one that was sent the most, was Upper. And so that kind of caught on, but I think it also got picked up by people from outside of the UP and started using it. But I think deeper than that is that there had always been this identity of the people in the UP as being backward.
Sure.
And that there are these people who live out in the woods, you know, all have outhouses. And, you know, there's no roads past the bridge. They also take snowmobiles or dog sleds, which would be a lot of fun. And it became an identity that had been kind of thrust on the people of the UP, maybe well earned at times.
Yeah.
But also at times a negative identity, especially for people downstate who came up here and loved how beautiful it was, but didn't understand the people of the UP.
Sure.
You know, and so I remember when I moved up here as a kid, we moved up here from Flint, and one of the people the fathers of one of my best friends, had said, "Oh, you're going to go live with the hillbillies," you know,
yeah,
because that's what he thought of the UP, as just a bunch of hillbillies. And at that time, we didn't even know the term Upper, or I didn't. So it was something that kind of came along in the 80s, and that's when it really, people started to identify with it. One of the best books about that is was written by Kate Remlinger about the Upper accent, but she really delves into the idea of how it was, the identity at first was kind of thrust on Uppers, but then they embraced it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And you know, it got me thinking about, and you mentioned kind of the shift in you know, folks now, like, that's a huge point of pride, right? Like, so many businesses have rebranded to reflect, you know, some aspect of the Upper Peninsula, and there's been a lot of attention drawn to maps, right, that leave off the UP, or, you know, identified as part of Wisconsin or part of Canada or something like that. So that's really, you bring up a lot of interesting things. Just it's such a unique, just the geography, like just looking at a map, right? I mean, the geography is so unique compared to most of the rest, well, I would say all of the rest of the lower 48. I mean, yeah, that's just,
Yeah,
that's,
and it's the whole map thing I find interesting because there, I think it developed in kind of what happened. Obviously, was that people would be creating these Michigan maps with just the. I'm trying to get it right. I think there it is. With just the mitten,
mm-hmm,
and so now across the UP, you see businesses and entities, even northern. Our symbol, our official symbol is the UP with a torch through the middle.
right,
That in some ways is a response to that sense that they were not being included. And so, but the thing is that now people up here will complain, oh, they did a Michigan map and they didn't include us. I'm like, well, we don't include them all the time.
right,
I mean, um, so both sides have kind of staked their thing.
yeah,
Uh, but whenever I'm on like the Historical Society of Michigan board, and whenever I go down, I talk to people about this stuff and we joke about it. And I always have to remind them that we are part of the state. But they know full well. And having grown up downstate and up here, I have a little different perspective than people who've only lived up here or only lived down there. And we did an exhibit on the idea of UP statehood a few years ago. And for me, in the end, it's kind of like that's what I love about Michigan is that we are these two like different states that have found this arrangement, you
mm-hmm,
know, and that's what makes the state so interesting. And so I as much as I love being growing up in the UP and living here, I love being from Michigan as well. And not everyone feels that way. Some people want the UP to be a separate state, and I can understand that. But I like the fact that we're part of Michigan. Um, it, it's challenging, but it is, you know.
yeah, absolutely. And I feel the same way. Um, just having spent some time downstate as a kid, and family and things like that in the Grand Rapids area. And one of the interesting things is just the diversity of landscapes and just geography across the state, from even across, pick any region. You have the whole Lake Michigan shoreline of the Lower Peninsula and all the beach towns and sand dunes and that sort of thing. And then, the east side of the state, with the whole Detroit metro area, and then you have the Thumb, and then of course across, from east to west across the UP, there's such a difference. It's just that's one of the things that I find compelling about the state is, you can go from, we have these pseudo oceans, that surround us on all sides, and um, you know, small mountains and other things like that, and beaches, and it's, you know, that's such a unique part. Like you said, there's a lot to offer in both peninsulas, I guess.
Well, there is. There's a lot of identity in all those places.
Right. Yeah,
And I think
people's,
that's,
yeah.
people really do identify with the part of the state that they're from versus sometimes more so than their statehood. And I think I probably identify being from the UP more than being a Michigander, but I think that's what makes it cool. And other states are like that, but I don't know too many states that are quite as diverse as Michigan in that respect. I think that it has some unique qualities to it that a lot of states don't have. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And
Absolutely.
New York, I lived in New York State for a while, and there you have New York City and the rest of the state.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same situation with Michigan. It's with Detroit and the rest of the state. It it's that similar type of relationship that the two have with one another, and a lot of states have that urban rural divide. but I think in UP it's or in Michigan it's very diverse, and it's what makes it interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
I agree.
I think also too what makes it interesting is just the mix of people,
Yeah.
um, because a lot of people will talk about how the UP isn't a very diverse place, and what they mean is racially it's not very diverse, and compared to other places it certainly isn't. Um, but culturally we're very diverse, and whether it be from the Native American community to the the ethnic groups that came here and the amalgamations that came out of those. I studied the dialect for a while. The UP was going around and interviewing people from different parts of the UP because a lot of people think of the UP accent as being monolithic. It's
Mm-hmm.
like one accent, when in reality, one town could be one way, could speak one way, and another very
Yeah.
different. And a lot of it has to do with who are the people who settled, you know, where there are a lot of Finns, where there are a lot of Italians, Germans, um, Canadians. Um, so the accent of the stew is very different from those people who grew up in Calumet.
Right.
Um, and yet there's certain things about it that are shared. So I think that there's a lot of diversity within our communities. If it's not racial, it's cultural, and that's one of the things that I've really worked hard at with the center is to try to show that diversity, um, and why it's important to who we are.
Yeah. Yeah, I just was taking some time to kind of browse through some of the past exhibits, you've had, and I noticed that, the center did a really great job, I think, um, capturing a lot of those different, um, cultural influences, that have kind of all shaped the various areas around the UP. Like you said,
Yeah, and
the oh, go ahead.
no, I was just saying there's still a lot of places we haven't gone, and a lot of it is just like lack of research. It just hasn't been done yet. Like
Mm,
on the African American community in the UP, there's a former professor at Northern who's really diving into that right now, Russ Minyagi, who's trying to really find the earliest African American settlers and residents of the UP, going all the way back to Mackinac when the
yeah,
fort was there. And but even you know families and groups of people who are now here today, because it's a part of our history we just don't know much about, because we assumed to some extent, uh, you know, wrongly, that they haven't been here or they haven't made any impact.
right.
And I hope in this research we'll find that there's enough to create an exhibit out of it, because it's an area we haven't really looked at.
Yeah, that'll be really interesting to see how that comes together.
I think also too is just that the Finnish identity is so prominent in the UP,
Mhm.
and I'm a part of that. I'm a quarter Finn, um, but I'm also half French Canadian. You know,
Okay.
so I think we I would say we overemphasize the Finn. It tends to kind of become the dominant talk when people talk
Yeah,
about the UP culture. Oh, it's all the Finns, and sure, that's part of it. But there are parts of the UP where there aren't a lot of Finns.
right.
Where French Canadians or Germans or Croatians might outnumber them. You know,
Yeah,
and I've lived in a lot of those different communities in the UP that had and have spent a lot of time with them that have really diverse or non-Finnish um, dominance, and so I think that the UP is much more diverse in that respect than just being everyone's a Finn. But at the same time, Finnish culture has become so much a part. The Finnish American culture has become such a part of our identity,
yeah,
like such as the sauna, okay, which is a truly Finnish tradition, but now it's a Yooper tradition.
yeah.
Just like the pasty is a Cornish thing.
I like
But
to joke, I'm 75% Finnish and 25% English, and the English side of my family came from Cornwall, so
Yeah,
I got the pasties and the saunas kind of
you got it all, man. You
both
got
at play here, total package.
it.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that's a great thing about the UP is that, and it's because these people stayed. They came, and this was a tough place to live. You know, it was a tough place to make a living, and and they stayed. Many of these groups stayed when the mines, dwindled,
Yeah.
and made homes and made communities. And so you had these communities where there were all these Italians and Swedes and Finns. They intermarried, and that created the culture of a place like Ishpeming, you know, or a town like I grew up in the town of Wakefield in the western UP,
Mm,
which was mostly Finn, but also very um, Serbian, Montenegrin, Croatian, um, and and it had a lot to do with who was coming over at certain points of time in the history of the mines and why they populated certain areas. So it's an interesting mix of all these people, um, and so there are aspects of that in the culture, the food, the music. When I was growing up, there was a Tamburitzin band who played all the town events and things. And that was somewhat unique for the UP even. Um, and then the Keweenaw was just a melting pot of so many different groups of people. Marquette was very much a French town. And though there were Finns who lived here, but one of the most dominant groups were the French. And my dad grew up here. So, I mean, um, my great grandfather was born in Marquette, and he never really spoke much English. He could live in Marquette without really knowing how to speak English
yeah.
as a French person.
Wow.
So,
So if I can, I want to jump back to the Beamuier Heritage Center for just a couple minutes. So we talked a little bit about some of the uh, well, not specifically about the exhibits, but sort of how you go about putting those together. But I wanted to ask a little bit about, you have some interesting collections and artifacts there too. It sounds like. So you mentioned a lot of artifacts from the history of the university, but also some artifacts from prominent individuals in the UP's history. So, Seaborg and Volker and Jacob Eddy. Um, you talk a little bit about some of those artifacts that you have and display.
yeah, it's a really cool collection from these individuals. And like the Seaboard collection is really fascinating because he led such an incredible, fascinating life and played a really important role in the development of atomic energy. Now, the new, the atom bomb is as well, which
Yeah.
isn't a thing, but he really worked his entire career after that to try to reduce um, the proliferation of nuclear weapons, and which is why he was at the Atomic Energy Commission. So we have all of his stuff. For whatever reason, the University of California, where he had been chancellor and had been professor, didn't want his collection.
Hmm.
They didn't want his records. They didn't want his. And I'm not really sure what happened there. Um, I guess maybe there he's just another Nobel Prize winner.
Yeah. Well, I find
Yeah,
that interesting because he spent such a small part of his life here, but he's so um you know well established as part of UP history and Ishpeming history.
yeah, absolutely. And
That's really interesting.
part of it was that he kept those connections. I mean, he didn't. He returned here on a number of occasions. He had family here, and he had a deep affinity for the UP, even though he left when he was 10. I think it left a big mark on him and who he was. Um, and you know, he moved in some very heady circles, and yet he always seemed to be a very down to earth person. And I think that comes to some extent from working class UP background, um, which I think he never really got rid of. I think it really kept him solid. And we have so much cool stuff from his collection, and we recently had some items donated. Uh, and I'm not sure if it's public yet, what some of those things are, but I hope we'll be making it public soon. Because the family still had a bunch of his old medals that he had received and sent them to us. So
Wow.
we're in the process of cataloging a lot of that stuff and getting it ready for display probably next May. That stuff will go, well, I think for graduation is when we're planning to have that stuff on display at the Seaborg Center. But it's just a fascinating story. He was an interesting guy. I had a chance to read through a lot of his diaries. This is a guy who, from the age of, like, I don't know, 16, made an entry about every single day of his life. And sometimes it was just, I ate this for breakfast and I went to work and I did this and listened to some records, and that was it. Other days, talking about experiments he's working on and things that are happening. It's really fascinating to read. Well, some of it's fascinating, some of it's really dull. But that really helped because I was putting together a biography for this display that we're going to be creating, and it really helped. But Jacob Eddy, kind of the polar opposite in a way. Where Seaborg was this, scientist, very well educated. Uh, um, Jacob Eddy was the opposite, and yet had his own impact on the UP. Well, you could say much greater impact on the UP than Seaborg did. But he was such a fascinating person too. Someone needs to write a book about Jacob Eddy. I've thought about it, maybe writing a book about Jacob Eddy. The problem is that, and I don't mean this in a derogatory way, but there's almost like a cult of Jacob Eddy, and people aren't real honest about it. They don't want to, because to write a biography of Jacob Eddy, a true one, you'd have to look at some of his negative attributes too, politically, and personally, I don't know about that. I didn't know the man, but not everything he did politically was necessarily in the best interest of the state of Michigan. It was in the best interest of the UP, usually, but not in the best interest of the state of Michigan. And he was the poster child for term limits. He's the reason we have term limits now, the state of Michigan, because he was in office so long and became so powerful that people just said, we can't allow that to happen. And the reason why was because he had such a control in the purse strings of the state. So I would like to write a biography of him that's honest. But there's so many people who are just like, oh, no, you can't go there, I had one guy who was the head of the Democratic Party of the state of Michigan, who I know, and he just said, I could tell you stories, but I wouldn't want you to publish it. Because he said I would get in such trouble with people in the party. And so there is this kind of like protection of his legacy in some respects. So
Sure.
he was a complicated guy.
I think being a a biographer, or anyone who compiles history, yeah, I think that's an interesting thing you bring up. People who have complicated legacies, maybe, or even just certain aspects like you mentioned.
Well, here's an interesting thing about him. His legacy is, we have this display at the Superior Dome dedicated to him that I manage. And about 10 years ago, well, it was a little longer than that. I get contacted by someone saying, "Hey, we have a plaque for Jacob Betty that we want to put in there." And I'm like, he's been dead for like over 10 years. And there's people still creating plaques for him.
Hmm.
So it just gives you an idea of how important he was to so many groups of people, especially in the labor movement.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm a union member myself, so I get that. But it's almost like, there's this. I had to laugh at first. I was like, "What?" But I'm like, well, okay, he was really important to people, but that he's getting plaques dedicated to him in death is says something.
Yeah,
I think we laughed
absolutely.
about it because we have so many plaques in our collection from him that's ridiculous. I mean, he was the plaque king. So
So it was interesting to hear a little bit about Jacob Eddy because I'll be honest, the only so I have my work cut out for me because the only two folks on this list of collections you have for different prominent UP individuals are Seaborg, because I'm a chemistry teacher, and so of course I find a lot of what he did, really really interesting, um, and even more so being that he's from Ishpeming, which is also where I grew up. The other, as I mentioned when we had been emailing, I'm a big John Volker fan, and when you were talking about Glenn Seaborg sort of hanging out in these really heady circles, but staying down to earth, that he popped into my mind right away. With all of his high profile legal work, but then preferring to hang out at fish camp and be on the water as much as possible.
yeah, I think that's the great thing about being a Youper. I I was just part of this concert we did for Hiawatha on UP folk songs, and we did the second week of deer camp. And I talked a lot about with the other guys who played with it. The Upers, we some of their stuff is purely just laughable and goofy, but they occasionally hit a nerve, you know, in their songs, a political nerve about that relationship with the UP and downstate, but also too just the identity. And one of the great things they said one song was that, and I don't remember the exact line, but it doesn't matter. You could be a doctor, a lawyer, or a lumberjack, and we're all the same.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a lot of truth. I moved here from Traverse City, where I'd been working for several years, and I love that area. But part of the reason that my wife and I wanted to move back up here was because there's a real class system in Traverse City, and we never. There were certain parts of the Traverse City culture that we were never going to be invited to be a part of. You know,
Sure.
um, not that we necessarily wanted to be, but there definitely is this class structure there that when you come up here, it's not the same. You know, you could be a working class person, but your best friend could be a optometrist or a doctor or a lawyer, even a state rep. You know, we have a different attitude. It's much more of an egalitarian view of culture up here, and I'm not exactly sure where that comes from. I think part of it comes from that we didn't have the same kind of ruling economic class here that a lot of places had because so many of the people who controlled the money didn't live here.
Sure.
The mining companies, the logging companies to some extent weren't owned by Ubers. They were owned by people from outside of here. And when those companies left, they left behind the workers. And it was their kids who went on to become doctors and lawyers and state reps and teachers
Yeah.
and professors. And such as my grandmother, who grew up in West Ishpeming on Varnum Street. Is it Varnum or Barnum?
That's a good question. I'm trying to remember. I know the street, but I can't remember how it's spelled.
Anyway, my great grandfather worked in the Cliff Shaft mine.
Yeah.
Okay, he was a Finnish immigrant. His wife was a Finnish immigrant. They had 12 kids. I think all but one or two of them went to college and went on to professional careers. My grandmother was a teacher, but she had a brother who was a dentist. In fact, his office was in the same building as John Volker's law practice. So it what happened was that second or third generation just became much more culturally uh, expansive, and so people maybe were professionals, but they had these working class roots, and it just created a much more egalitarian culture, for lack of a better term. And I think it's just a part of the UP's identity it's one of the things I identify really well with. There isn't there are people in the UP who have lots of money, but you would hardly know it sometimes,
Mm-hmm.
and I think people also just know, even if they do, you don't flaunt it up here. It's not something people won't respect you if you do. There's that great story when that guy bought the land in Shelter Bay, was building all those beautiful homes along the coast, just outside of Shelter Bay. He built a fence along the highway, a wooden fence it went for about a half mile or more, delineating where his land was. And he had to take it down because people were incensed that he would do that. So, like, yes, we know that's your land. You don't need to shove it in our face.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, they said, you either take it down or we're burning it down. And he took it down. I mean, it's made the free press. Free press. And I think that to me that's so typical of the UP, and kind of that we don't tolerate that kind of ostentatious identity that other places do.
Mm-hmm.
Where what you have and that kind of materialism is very important to the culture. It's not as important
Yeah. Yeah, I can see that in a lot of different aspects. I mean, I just think about, you kind of described the progression, sort of originating with, working class folks, and, whether they were logging or mining or, whatever they were doing. And then, their kids and grandkids, going on, maybe to higher education or whatever, working as professionals, but not, but still retaining, um, a piece of that, like you said, their roots, that working class identity. Yeah.
here. Yeah, I think it's a part of the UPA identity itself. And you know, my dad and my mom both came from pretty modest means. I mean, but education was really important. They both went to Northern to get their degrees. They became teachers. My dad then became an administrator. My dad was the superintendent of the schools, but he was also a little rough around the edges, and so he had both. We laugh about that, about he had both sides. He had the professional tie coat, position side of him, and then he had the hunting camp side of him, which was very different.
Mm-hmm.
And and I think that's something that in the UP is just kind of built in.
Yeah,
You
the way you just described that, I have, probably 10 different people I know or have known who would, fit a similar description, where they can, kind of play one role in their professional life, and, but then have that more down to earth, especially, UP based identity. Yeah, that's really neat.
Yeah, I mean, Volker was a good example of that.
It's interesting to me reading some of his interactions with, all the different cast and crew and directors, when they were shooting Anatomy of a Murder, and I forget what I was reading, but I want to say, well, because Otto Preminger was the director, correct?
Right.
If I have that right, and I think at one point he it sounded like he was getting a little bit frustrated maybe because Volker was, he was MIA so much, out in the mornings fishing and doing this and that, and that's kind of funny.
They seem to take the cast really seemed to take to Volker. Um, I mean, that whole thing is fascinating. That the making of the movie. It's a great story. We did an exhibit about it um, that we tour. It's a traveling exhibit. Um, we put it online, but there's too much licensing that we'd have to do with regards to like Sony Pictures and all that.
Sure.
But it's such a fascinating story, and how things were so different then. I mean, his book came out in '58, I believe it was, or in '57. By the end of the year, the rights had been bought. By March or by January of '59, Preminger's here scouting locations. By March, April, they're arriving, shooting the film. It comes out in the summer of '59.
Well,
That timeline is so fast. Today, it would take,
yeah, I was gonna say I can't imagine a
you know,
modern film being put together that fast, especially shooting on location and you know,
yeah.
yeah,
But that's why it's such an important film for the play for the UP is because, and Marquette County particularly, is because they shot it all here, and the community was so involved in the making of the film. So many people were involved and had memories of this going on, which was unusual. Usually they would just show up and do a few shots outside to make it look like they were there and shoot everything in the studio, which is
right,
what they originally intended to do. But the artistic director of the film just said, I can't recreate the flavor of this place. It's already here. Why would we do that? Let's just shoot it here, you know? And they did. And I mean, I think it benefits from that. It's real.
right,
It's a real place, real interiors, the real character versus some Hollywoodized version of it. And it
yeah,
was really a unique thing, and that's why it has such a connection to the community, and the fact that it's a really great film. You know,
right,
and
yeah.
it
It's
is.
such a fascinating story. I mean, he just yeah, and before I go any further, that when you were talking about it being real because it was shot here, that I think about something like The Office, right? And kind of picked an obscure town, right? Scranton, Pennsylvania, and there's these, you know, it's where it's set, and there's these, shots at the beginning, but of course, it's all shot in Los Angeles, and in a studio, or there's numerous other TV shows, you know, supposed to be taking place in Milwaukee or wherever, but you know so that's very very neat that um Ishpeming and Michigami and Big Bay and Marquette are all like actually featured.
Yeah,
That's
they're part of the backdrop. Well, they are the backdrop, but the people, the extras, the interiors. I mean, are all from here, and I think it's too now. There've been a few films that have been made up here, and not just Escanaba and Moonlight, but a few others, and it'll be interesting to see. I mean, I think the UP has been discovered,
mm-hmm.
uh, but I think that we've only just seen the tip of the iceberg with regards to the identity uh, going out to the larger cultural, the nation's cultural
Yeah,
identity.
well,
And,
at the
so,
beginning I think about, we were talking about the regional identities and some of the differences with the Lower Peninsula and then the Upper Peninsula, and I can imagine being from somewhere else in the country, and that'd be a little bit hard to grasp, I think, at first, that you can have one state, a unified state that has such distinct um regional identities. That's
Yeah.
yeah.
And geographically, I mean, I do think it's interesting because we are obviously closer to Wisconsin, and geographically, it would have made sense for us to be part of Wisconsin.
Yeah.
But I don't, and maybe it's because I grew up downstate, I have a much deeper connection to lower Michigan and Wisconsin. But I think most Upers generally have a stronger connection to lower Michigan than they do to Wisconsin. Um, Other than maybe they root for the Packers, you know. But I don't think of most Upers as having this deep connection to Wisconsin. Um, and it, but they do seem to have. I mean, some don't have any connection with Lower Michigan either. But I don't know. I think there is this being that we're in a state together that contributes to that. And I don't know. I think television and popular culture has changed everything as well. So I think it's great that things such as discovering is still going on at TV6, and a friend of mine is now in charge of that, and she's doing a great job. Because I think it's important that we keep showing people and delving into that culture of the UP, which is changing. I mean, I live here. I consider myself a Uper, certainly an honorary Uper, a transplant Uper. But there are a lot of parts of my life that are not Uper at all. I mean, I don't hunt, I don't fish,
Sure.
So
Yeah.
am I a Uper if I don't hunt? I think so. But there are a lot of people who are just like, no, you have to be a hunter to be a Uper. I think there's a new UP culture too that's not involved in those things, and that's fine. I have no problem with people who hunt or fish either. I grew up in that culture. I just don't. It
Yeah.
never caught on with me. Uh, I think that I think one of the biggest challenges I think we see. Oh, sorry about that.
No problem. I think there should be plenty of time on this one for us to be able to uh to finish up and chat a bit more.
I
Um,
can't hear you.
oh, sorry. Let's see. You hear me okay? Nothing, hey?
Oh, now I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can, yeah. Yep, you're
Oh,
coming through.
all right. Yeah, I think my internet died. Um,
No problem.
I guess.
Actually,
Oh, I'm sorry.
go ahead.
No, the point I was making about that the environmental community were kind of painted as being outsiders, people who weren't from the UP originally,
Yeah.
or Marquette County especially, and that the people who were for the mine were all locals,
Oh,
and that this is kind of, I think, the big challenge I think the UP is going to have in the coming years is this kind of divergence between this growing community in the UP who are very environmentally minded and don't want to see development for extraction industries. And those people who grew up in the extraction industry or in towns that were built on the extraction industry who welcome it and want to see the development of those things. I think that's going to be the toughest thing we're going to have to navigate in the future culturally is that kind of disconnect that sometimes is going on
yeah.
there. Even
Yeah,
right
that's
down, like uh, wind turbines, which are, something that we probably should be tapping for environmental purposes, but people don't want them.
yeah.
Some of them are even environmentally minded people who are just saying, no, but we don't want those because, of this and that. So it's really complicated.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think you bring up a lot of interesting things. I recently was watching so Dan Cornyn had put together a documentary on Nagani, the Iron Town, that he showed at Fresh Coast Film Festival last fall. And having grown up in Ishpeming, Nagani, I was sort of familiar with the town's background, and of course I had family and friends who worked in the mines. And it's interesting, looking at Nagani maybe just as one case study, but the documentary talks a lot about the shift they've been navigating as a city from basically the epicenter of iron mining to a recreation and tourism based economy like a lot of other areas around the UP. Um, and even some cool instances where they can blend some of that history with recreation, like the Iron Ore Heritage Trail and things like that. So
Mhm.
it's yeah, that's an interesting thing that um a lot of community, I spent a few years down in Manistee, and you bring up the wind turbines, and of course the Garden Peninsula has that huge wind farm. And that was kind of a point of contention in that part of the UP. um yeah, definitely some big issues and interesting mix of views. And it'll be interesting to see how a lot of communities handle that going forward.
Yeah, I mean that. I think it's going to be a challenge, and I don't predict anything, but I think that what I can say is I don't think it's going to get easier, um, because the demands of a society, a country, a planet that is growing so fast, and that these things right here uh, require a lot of things that are underground,
Right.
and that's going to, we all live by these things. At the same time, it's going to mean more mining operations. It's going to mean uh, things that we don't necessarily like, and so we have to find some way through it, and I don't have the answers. I just think that it's one of the challenges that we're going to be facing in the world. But I think in the UP we're doing it on a micro level. It's um, everything from the line, the gas line to the mines that are popping up. There's going to be more mines popping up in the UP in the coming years. Um, which are going to be contentious, but I think that to me, the big one is going to be water. Um, that in the future there's no question that water is as a resource is going to become more and more important, more and more valuable, and we have more water than anybody.
Mm-hmm.
And there are parts of the United States that are drying up, and what's going to happen when there's not enough water in the Great Plains to water the crops that feed our country and the world?
Right. Yeah, when you say that, I think of, you know, different UP based businesses or writers or personalities, kind of using that scenario as like an April Fool's joke, oh,
Yeah, yeah.
water from Lake Superior being shipped to California, but like you say, in the future that might not be a joke anymore, right? I
No,
mean,
I don't
we
think it
have
is.
we have so much water, but yet, we have an overabundance, and then like you say, other areas of the country, and a big part of which we're relying on for food and stuff, as you say, um, you know, often don't.
I think too is that, there are a lot of communities that were so tied up with mining that are no longer mining communities. Like the Western UP, where I grew up, was a huge mining district, and there is no mining there. There hasn't been a mine open for 60 years there.
Yeah.
And yet there is still this huge identity with that as an industry and an economy that people forget that, these companies came in, they built these towns, and then when it didn't suit them financially anymore, they just left. And they left behind communities that are still struggling. They're continually decreasing in population and resources, and and yet you'll hear people say we got to bring the mines back. It's like, it didn't turn out so great the first time. They made their millions and then they moved on. The UP, I mean, we weren't alive to see it, but the UP in the early 20th century was not a beautiful place.
Yeah.
It was a wasteland. It was an industrial wasteland.
Yeah.
Uh,
I see photographs from, an area like, Fayette comes to mind, or even, the Negaunee-Ishpeming area, or the Lakeshore and Marquette from
mhm.
that era. And yeah, there's a part of me, and I think a lot of folks, in 2022, who would romanticize, oh, I wonder, the UP 100 years ago. But yeah, for an era there, it wasn't so beautiful.
No, it was prosperous, but
Yeah.
they had really altered the landscape.
Yeah.
Greatly altered the landscape, and um, obviously that's happened in a lot of places. Um, what's interesting though is because it largely went away, you have some of these towns have been retaken over by nature.
Yeah.
A friend Michael Lokinen made a wonderful film about the community of Winona in the Copper Country, which was a mining town that's now gone, and it's being reclaimed by the forest. And that's an interesting idea of this, that it's now been taking over. It was, we tore it all down, and now it's taking it back.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for mining and lumbering. That's why my family came here, and I'm happy they did. I'm happy I live here and I have that legacy. But I don't think it's our future. I don't think the UP's future is in extraction industries. I think
Yeah.
it's got to be something else, um, because those are really feast and famine industries anyway, and totally dependent on demand, on labor costs, uh, and I think that we need to have a more diversified view of our future than just we need more mines, we need more lumbering.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think you raise a great point, because when those industries are so tied to folks' identities, in many cases, you know, obviously very important to recognize that, and to, as you say, a lot of us, that's why our families came in the first place. But at the same time, realizing that that's, as you brought up, that's probably not our path forward. um Looking at just the boom and bust, as you said too, with mining, um it's just not a sustainable thing long term in any way. So
And it never has been, I
yeah,
mean,
exactly. Yeah.
the, the Palmer mines are an exception in the UP, but they're not going to be there forever either, you know.
Hmm.
Um, and and there are lots of places around the country that there's examples of that same thing happening. A lot of people from the UP who lost their jobs in the mining went out to like Butte, Montana, to work. Uh, there's a lot of Finns in Butte, Montana, and there's no mines there either. I mean, I don't think so, but that it's their economy is really bad because the whole idea was all built around this industry that then just disappeared. And uh, but who knows? Maybe the next element will be discovered deep under the crust in Go-Give-It County, and they'll be millionaires. Who's to say? The new miracle mineral that's going to save the world. Uh, who knows?
And that makes me think, and we talked about this earlier, with kind of the being able to have the Upper identity, but also, engage in, these more, I don't want to say academic necessarily, but more advanced, more innovative areas of of society and culture, and being able to recognize those roots that we came from, but having folks in the UP who are innovators too. um you know I think that's
I
maybe,
I
that's
I
maybe a path
agree.
forward.
That's one of the things I think coming back to Marquette because I left in 1990 when I graduated from Northern and I came back in 2007. And then since that time, what I have seen, and I think is really encouraging, is that, I grew up when I grew up, the whole idea was that your future was not in the UP. You got your high school degree, maybe you get your college degree here, but you would leave.
Yeah.
And we always thought of our future as being outside of the UP. That's changing. There are a lot of young people who are saying, no, I'm not leaving. I want to create a life for myself here. And they become very entrepreneurial. They cobble together two or three different things to be able to live here. Um, and it's because they identify so much with it as a place that they're going to find their way to be able to stay here. And I think that's a really encouraging sign, and that creates that innovation. Um, and I think in Marquette and Ishpeming, Nagani, you're seeing that. I It's funny because in recent years there's been kind of this battle, people talking about houses are so expensive in Marquette. I have to move to Nagani. I have I have to move to Ishpeming. It's terrible, and I'm like, 25 years from now, that's going to be where it's at. Nagani and Ishpeming are going to be where it's happening. Marquette is going to be full of a bunch of retirees like me and wealthy people who bought houses on the shore, um, or people who work at the hospital or university.
Sure.
But the young families and the young energy is all going to head up the hill. And it's
And across
because
the
it's,
UP too, I see, in the era of COVID and remote work, there's so many different organizations pushing for remote work, move to the UP, work remotely, look at these amazing outdoor areas and things we have. So that'll be interesting to see how that changes communities and
yeah, I think
you know.
so. And I think I think that's in some ways the future, for a lot of these communities. Um, and we're already seeing it in some
Mhm.
ways. And we're seeing it, Nagani and Ishpeming are already seeing some transformation in really positive ways. And it's because you have uh, people who are really innovative who said, "This is my town, and I want to make something here."
Yeah.
Uh, Dan Perkins is one, in Ishpeming is, you know, is so involved in the community and trying to give it something different, because he said, "This is my town. I want to create something here, and that's going to keep happening." And I've seen a huge transformation in those places, um, and that's a great sign, you know. And there are people who aren't from here who are coming here, whether they come here for college or other reasons, who just like, this is where I want to be, you know. There's nothing like this place, and I work with a lot of students, and so many of them, when they graduate, are like, I don't want to leave, you know. I wish I could find, and some of them don't. Some of them stay. They find a way to do it, but many more would rather stay than
Mm.
leave.
That's interesting and that's encouraging because, like I said, I'm not that old, but even when I was in high school, and early college, it almost was, growing up, just, a few miles away from Marquette, there was kind of a mentality of, oh, you're just going to stay and live at home and go to NMU, and let's,
Yeah,
go all off across the country. But that's interesting to hear that there's, maybe, and maybe these, I don't know, maybe most of these folks aren't from here, or maybe some of them are, but that's interesting to hear.
it's funny, when we were several years ago, we were changing Northern's identity branding, and at that time, Northern's tagline was "Northern Naturally,"
I remember that. Yeah.
and and a lot of people were like, "We shouldn't get rid of that. That's so positive, natural, natural." And I'm like, actually, for a lot of Upers, it had this connotation of, well, I'm going to Northern naturally. Where the hell else am I going
Oh,
to go?
sure.
And
Yeah,
so
makes
it was
sense.
more like, well, yeah, and that's, for me. I came to Northern because I really couldn't afford to go anywhere else, um, and and I intended to go to Northern for my 2 years and then go on to a real college. And I fell in love with Northern as a university, and found that it was truly unique, and it is, and that's why I came back and worked here now for 15 years, is because of that. And um, so to me, it's more creating a sense that this is where it's at. This is where you want to be. It's not just a fallback college. Um, you know, I don't know how many friends I had who went off to Michigan or Michigan State who didn't last a year because they couldn't stand being in that environment. You
Sure.
know, they thought they would. They came back and went here because they're like, this is where it's at. You know,
Well, it's we're getting close to the end here, so I want to just thank you again for taking the time to chat and for navigating through the multiple Zoom calls.
that's okay.
Um it's been a pleasure and yeah, really appreciate you taking the time to share some of your perspective and then also some of the work you've been doing with the Beamuier Heritage Center.
Well, thanks for giving me a chance to talk about it, and just the opportunity. And it's been a pleasure. This is fun. I could talk about this stuff all night long, unfortunately. you know, and sometimes though, this is what I do. So it's like, oh, I want to talk about something else. But tonight, I really enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun, and it's important work. That's why I came back. That's why I've stayed. This is an important work, and and it can make an impact here, which is, why I'm here.
Thanks again, Dan. I appreciate it.
Thank you.